Clarkson University, who is also a partner, will also be running whole fish homogenates for their routine list of analytes with the Great Lakes Fish Monitoring Program. So those routine analytes range from legacy contaminants like PCBs and DDT to PPCPs, some of which are considered to be endocrine disruptors. The next slide, Objective 4, documenting seasonal differences in concentrations of these compounds in both in the effluent, the stream, and in the fish. Sorry, I can talk closer into the thing. Thanks, Tom. Effluent and stream samples were collected in both September and October in the fall, and then again in February and April for the spring. We collected 24 largemouth bass for the National Fish Tissue Study in the fall, 12 largemouth bass for our particular study, and 9 largemouth bass was collected at the reference location, and again, that was Lake Michigan. In the spring, again, we got the 24 largemouth bass for the National Fish Tissue Study. We got 9 largemouth bass for us, in addition to 14 common carp, so we were able to greatly increase our N. And 12 largemouth bass, 13 carp, and 2 catfish from the Braidwood Cooling Pond. Moving on to some preliminary results, we're going to look at the estrogenic effects of fish in fall of 2006 slide. This was very much qualitative information. We had a very low sample size, so Dr. Schoenfusch was only really comfortable in presenting this type of information. But the take-home message was that immature largemouth bass did not produce plasma vitellogenin. All the female largemouth bass did produce plasma. Most of the male largemouth bass in the North Shore Channel produced vitellogenin at concentrations approaching those found in female largemouth bass at both sites, and no differences in vitellogenin was found between female largemouth bass at the 2 collection sites. Also, there was no intersex or other pathological conditions were discovered at either location. This is a slightly more complicated slide because of our larger sample size. We've moved on to the spring 2007 results. The interesting bits from this particular slide were that VTG analysis found high plasma concentrations in most of the female fish, which we expected. Let's see, only one largemouth bass collected at the North Shore Channel for VTG analysis, so there was again a low sample size. And but the VTG concentrations of the North Shore Channel largemouth bass was 10 times higher than the other largemouth bass collected in the cooling pond. Some thoughts around that with the water temperature at the cooling pond was actually a little bit higher, almost by about 10 degrees than the North Shore Channel. So it is possible that reproductive age was a little bit more advanced in the Braidwood Cooling Pond. And these are just some rough numbers for both carp and largemouth bass. And you'll notice that the numbers in the female common carp are extremely high. Those fish were just packed to the gills with some eggs. It was a bit gross. Moving on to the next slide, we've got some alkylphenols in largemouth bass, and these are just some general concentrations for NP, NP1EO, NP2EO, 3EO, and 4EO. And I guess the important thing to take home from this particular slide is that there were no, all the concentrations detected in both reference locations were below the MDL. Moving on to the next slide, this is percent compound detected both in the fall and the spring of, for the, let's see, this is effluent, sorry. And this actually does jive quite nicely with our hypothesis that we expected higher concentrations in the spring over the fall. So, or actually, no. This is just stream and effluent concentrations. I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll talk about seasonality in just a moment. Which brings us to our next slide. NP and notifiable ethoxylates at the Northside wastewater treatment plant and the effluent only. And this slide actually does a very nice job of displaying our hypothesis of seasonality, that the concentrations in spring are significantly higher than they are in the fall. And the red square boxed line is actually the water temperature. So as water temperature decreases, these concentrations, at least in the preliminary results, show an increase. The next slide, APEs in concentration versus temperature, and again, this is just another visual indication that with increased or decreased temperature, you have an increased concentration of these particular compounds. Moving on to the next slide, we've got APEs in the north side wastewater treatment plant effluent and downstream of the channel, for both the fall and the spring collections, looking at NP, 1EO, 2EO, 3EO. OP was in extremely low concentrations, and as was BAP. But again, we'll see the concentrations were generally higher in the effluent versus the stream, and were slightly, or we had very low concentrations of OPD, I guess. Here we have again effluent versus stream for both the NP1EC and the NP2EC. And what is the take-home message from this slide, Todd? We're on what?
The previous one.
Oh, okay. If you can move on to NPECs and north side. There we go. I'm going to ask Todd. I was trying to jump in for a moment.
I mean, the take-home message is that it's an effluent-dominated stream, so what we measure in the effluent is a lot easier to measure a concentration in the effluent than it is, as described, to throw a bucket over the bridge and haul it up 30 feet to analyze it. And the other take-home message is that you can look at the scale. Well, we're talking about tens of thousands of nanograms per liters of the ethoxycarboxylates, where it's not as high for the non-alphenols, and that's just the nature of what happens to that compound within the wastewater treatment plant.
All right, so if we move on to the following slide, some BCFs for the notophenols. These are some very back-of-the-envelope calculations of bioconcentration factors using our data from the North Side or the North Shore Channel. And you'll see that they do jive fairly well with some values that were published in the Mishlamore-Rice paper in 2006. However, our concentrations were generally from largemouth bass, and the Mishlamore-Rice concentrations were calculated using carp. The next slide is, we're going to skip it because it's far too difficult to look at, and the text is too small. So moving on to pharmaceuticals and effluent and stream samples for those with an eyesight worse than 2010. This is also another extremely small text slide, and we apologize, but it's just to give you a good idea of some of the chemicals that we were looking for and the ones that we found. To go over them quickly, the pharmaceuticals that were present at high parts per trillion to parts per billion. And please forgive my pronunciation of these. The gem for Brazil. Thank you. Some lisinopril and some valsartan, and then some additional chemicals that were present sort of in the mid-range: atenol, metoprol, dilzatem, and ibuprofen, for example. And this is the other list is the chemicals that were not detected. So moving on to our next to last slide, summary and next steps. What we really learned from this study is that collaboration truly is key. We were able to get an awful lot of work done for not a whole lot of money by trying to incorporate as many partners as possible. We did see that we did find estrogenic concentrations that were present in the fish, but we're not really certain as to what the significance of that is yet. I don't believe that we can take our study and translate it into a concentration of one alkylphenol leads to a certain estrogenic effect in the fish. Fish tissue concentrations do vary along with the effluent and stream concentrations, and then they had similar BCFs in both the fall and the spring. Wastewater effluent is a soup of thousands of compounds, so the things that we look for is just sort of the tip of the iceberg. There's plenty more in there. And then much more data is yet to come. As I mentioned, USGS only recently received some of the samples, so we're hoping for additional pharmaceutical and hormone analysis. And we're also hoping for some additional fish work out of Clarkson University. Which just brings us to our last slide. This is Todd Nedeshan's contact information, and he's a very good source of information and can always pass our questions along to myself as well. But you'll notice these are two of our fish collection days and some of the healthy-looking fish that came out of the North Side Channel. So at that, I can take any questions if anyone has.